Well, good afternoon, y'all. Get used to hanging out with me. I'm going to be here for another 3 hours. So I can't wait to talk, though, about the Permian Basin. It's super interesting. Emily, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for doing that. We have Mike Lewis. We have Brian Korgel here to talk about things. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. I want to talk, and I want to sort of throw this out there initially. The sort of theme being, when we talk about hydrogen, when we talk about this sort of industry, we think Southeast Texas, right? We think LaPorte, we think sort of the refining, Riviera down there. Why the Permian? Michael, I wanted to start with you. Sort of, why are we thinking about the Permian when we think about hydrogen? Why don't we just leave it to the folks in Southeast Texas?
Yeah, sure. So we're thinking a lot about the Permian based on some of the maps I showed this morning, right? All the natural resources. There's the natural gas, the oil industry out there, and of course the wind and solar.
Yep.
Emily can probably speak to this a little bit better, but she was showing the EU framework, right? So if we want to take advantage potentially of some of that wind and solar, you might have to have the hydrogen out there co-located with it. I also was showing sort of this grand vision of if we can take the fossil fuels, convert it to hydrogen, and suddenly transport that hydrogen elsewhere. I think there's opportunity to do that closer maybe to the well sites where we're bringing out the natural gas, and then build in pipelines, much like we're bringing all that energy already from the Permian to the Gulf Coast or to the demand centers. There's potential opportunity to do that with hydrogen as well.
It's also, it seems like we have workforce, we have sort of an industry there that already sort of knows energy. Brian, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about these partnerships that we can have with institutions, industry, sort of embracing the idea of this is a pretty young sort of industry, but there are a whole lot of people who know a whole lot of stuff out there, so we can sort of think about the Permian Basin because these folks know energy. Why not lean on that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we had a map of the Permian Basin. Maybe I'm not sure everyone knows where the Permian Basin is, but perhaps if you live in Texas, you know. But Permian Basin is a large area. West Texas spans into southeast New Mexico. It produces the most oil and gas in the nation. Texas is one of the leading wind producers, largely because of what's out in Permian Basin. Large solar producer. Texas is the second leading state in solar. So the Permian Basin is a major energy producer. And so, there are a few challenges with that. When you're a community that lives off oil and gas, oil and gas has boom and bust cycles. And so what's happening in the emerging energy economy, I guess I would define it that way, and hydrogen is part of that. How does that fit into the overall scope of energy? Right now, you have markets that are developing for hydrogen, clean hydrogen. Hydrogen's obviously used, but we're talking about scaling up markets so that people making the hydrogen have some place to sell it. And so right now, as we look towards the future of energy and what's happening, and we look at, if you consider the Permian Basin as one geographically large, diverse community, how does that future of energy, how will it impact those communities? How can they benefit from the energy? For the University of Texas at Austin specifically, UT system, we care a lot about the Permian Basin in West Texas because we have university lands out there, which is 2.1 million acres. And that's an energy producing asset as well. So for the University of Texas at Austin, the Permian Basin is a really important thing for us to think about.
And Emily, there isn't out in the Permian, there obviously isn't the sort of refining base there, but at the same time, you do have a ton of folks with CDLs. You have a ton of folks moving things around. And so that has to appeal, I imagine, to industry, to research, to sort of all the above.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think think one of the challenges, not exclusively to hydrogen, but any energy commodity, is you have to produce it, and then you have to move it to where you need it, and then you have to use it somewhere. And so certainly you're right, a lot of focus, rightly so, around the Gulf Coast, where we already have a lot of hydrogen consumption. So can we think about how can we produce clean hydrogen where we use it? With the Permian, it's more, okay, we see the opportunity to produce it there. How can we use it there so we don't have to move it there? And you hit Andy right on the key ones of we are moving and trucking around a lot of oil and gas, water and sand and all of that sort of stuff out there. So thinking about that as an opportunity. Hydrogen can also be blended at low levels in existing natural gas power plants. So that's another opportunity. Another exciting, more novel one would be ammonia for fertilizer production. Right. And so thinking about that kind of chain of feedstock, hydrogen to ammonia to fertilizer for some of those areas around there as well. So we see lots of opportunity to build new demand in the Permian.
It's exactly what I was going to, because Brian sort of brought this up as well, sort of the idea of we already use hydrogen for impurities in refined products, for ammonia, for chemicals. We're sort of projecting and we're modeling the idea that there is going to be demand. Are we field of dreamsing this? Are we, if we build it, it's, that demand's going to come? The models say it's going to happen, but you tell me.
Oh my gosh, I mean, the quintessential chicken and egg problem. I don't know how many times I've said that
Sure.
for all the times that I've been talking about hydrogen. But I think, I like the kind of concept of field of dreamings as maybe something that we're always doing about research. So that leads to lots of, I just spent a bunch of time talking about policy. So what policies would we need in place to be able to incentivize that new demand? But I think we're seeing interest enough to get started on that as an option.
Well, and specifically to that, this past summer, the Department of Energy put out a request for information, basically, to industry to try to determine how to solve the demand side of this problem, right? The hydrogen hubs are largely focused on production. Your last plot of the globe, I think those were all production. I don't know how much of that 37 million tons is spoken for. But with the DOE's looking at this, I think they're planning to put $1 billion into that. So that'd be on top of, I guess, all the other $8 billion. Maybe they're going to take it out of it. I hope not. But yeah, that's an important part of it. And we think there's opportunities in the Permian to be kind of its own hub, as Emily mentioned, with trucking or fertilizer or some other industries, so that maybe in the early stages of building out hydrogen production infrastructure there, you can focus on satisfying some local demand while you're getting to a capacity where maybe you can afford to put in a pipeline then to other areas.
The implication there being you sort of start regionally, because if you're talking about shipping across the nation, but also certainly if you're talking about exporting it internationally, then you're talking about the way in which you're producing that hydrogen. You start talking about that a bunch, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it just goes back to what I said this morning, like storing it, transporting it, distributing it, it's difficult. And if you can do it more locally, at least in the near term, that's going to help your economics.
In terms, Brian, of the research that we're doing out there and the sort of thinking that we're doing in terms of, obviously thinking about the demand, but also ramping things up. If we already have buyers, are research institutions scrambling to, if that demand happens sooner than we think, to sort of put that online?
Yeah, well, you mean in the Permian Basin specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the thoughts right now are, okay, you can generate the natural gas in the Permian Basin, pipe it down to the Gulf Coast.
Sure.
Why not just do that? So I think, and maybe, there will be some of that. But what you have is the potential to actually start making hydrogen on site, which will create new jobs, first of all. You start turning the Permian Basin a little more into a manufacturing center, perhaps. Like maybe you're making e-fertilizer, so using, you actually are producing a diverse range of products using the hydrogen that is generated in the Permian Basin. So what does the economics of that look like? The Hydrogen at Scale program, you guys at CEM did a really interesting study looking at the cost of transmitting electrons from renewables, so like solar and wind, and then doing electrolysis at the Gulf. Or is it actually more cost effective to make the hydrogen using those renewables in West Texas and then build a pipeline and ship it? And the energy density of shipping the hydrogen in a pipeline is much more effective, providing you're shipping that much hydrogen.
Right. That becomes a capacity question for sure. But I guess getting back maybe a little bit more to the benefits for the Permian that Brian touched on, I think, I presented at the end of my talk the wind power model potentially, right, and hydrogen following that. The same thing could happen in the Permian, what wind brought to the Permian back then, right? Struggling communities, people moving away from them, but wind power, as it ramped up, brought jobs, brought a new industry into those communities. And I think hydrogen has the opportunity to do so as well, maybe at a much larger scale, and especially when you start thinking about leveraging the existing knowledge and know-how and the skill sets that they have from the oil and gas industry. I told you this the other day. I figure it's worth repeating. I once got into a conversation in Raton, New Mexico at a gas station, I kid you not, for a half hour, with a gentleman who, he has a small business. He's in the oil exploration business. And I don't even know how we started talking about hydrogen. But when he heard the words come out of my mouth, he latched on and wouldn't let go of me. But he expressed why he was excited about hydrogen, because he sees this push towards electrification and decarbonization, thinking like his small business in the future may not be around. There may not be a need for oil exploration as much if we're all on wind or solar or whatever the case might be. But for him, he saw the commonalities with the hydrogen industry, and it gave him a lot of hope and promise, for handing that job or that business down to his kids and his grandkids in the future. So I think those communities have a lot to gain by this, by the hydrogen economy. So,
Emily, you were talking a lot about sort of the federal and international market for hydrogen and sort of the federal implications of policy and things like that. You talked a little bit about Texas, but I'm curious about sort of the things that are ratcheted down, or the things that come from. We can get into 45V and Q. But I'm curious sort of what these things mean for Texas. We have a fairly friendly regulatory environment here. Talk a little bit about sort of how these things trickle down.
Yeah, lots of opportunities on the federal level that I think Texas should make sure to take advantage of, and I think we are, and I think we could structure similar programs within the state, taking that federal model. And I think we also need to make sure that we don't lose sight of some of the unique advantages that we have in the state in terms of that regulatory environment. Great to see that part of those bills isn't just we need to give more money to hydrogen. It was to answer the question, I'm talking specifically about one of the recent Texas bills, answer the question of who is in charge of regulating hydrogen pipelines.
Right.
We already have hundreds of miles of hydrogen pipelines here in the state that have a different business model that I don't know enough to venture a fund into, but have heard enough about what a larger hydrogen economy might look like to need to change those business models. So making sure that we're staying on top of answering those types of questions, or at least identifying which group it is that needs to answer those types of questions about the pipelines, about the production, is really critical within the state.
Michael, you were talking about the interaction you had at a gas station in New Mexico. I'm curious about, you and I were talking a little bit, we were all sort of talking a little bit about the idea of when you say things like green hydrogen, when you say things like clean energy, in a place like the Permian Basin that's pretty, look, they've been oil and gas for a long time. And sort of talking about it in not necessarily a pejorative way, but almost an opportunity. Is there skepticism? Is there excitement? It sounds like, at least from the person you talked to, there's excitement, but at the same time, I'm curious about, is there a feeling of displacement there?
I think they look at clean hydrogen or hydrogen as an opportunity, right, for people who might be traditionally in the oil and gas side of things.
Yeah.
You're probably actually seeing more skepticism on the reverse side of it, right? Maybe environmental groups or so forth who think hydrogen might just be a way to keep the oil and gas industry in business longer, right? Which, I guess I can see that argument as well, but there might not be any way around it in a way. And I think, as I said this morning, I don't, at least in my view, I don't know about all of UT and everybody else up here, but, the fossil fuel is, it's a great resource, right? And it's the carbon part of it that's the bad part. It's not necessarily the entire fossil fuel. If we can get the hydrogen from it and manage the carbon, we can distribute clean energy throughout the world and, clean up a lot of tailpipes. So I don't think it should be looked at as an enemy. And I think people in the oil and gas industry are seeing this as an opportunity. The big oil and gas companies, the big energy companies, they are making moves. They're making strides to get into blue hydrogen. I don't know. I think we should keep encouraging it. So.
Well, and I think the emerging sort of attitude isn't an either or. It's not mutually exclusive, right? It's why don't we get in on this too?
How many times have I heard the DOE say all hands on deck?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's not just hydrogen, period, right? That's everything that we can do: carbon capture, batteries, electrification, right? We're up against the clock. Hydrogen's part of all those solutions, but it's all hands on deck.
Yeah, and I think in the Permian, there's not a sense that the oil and gas industry is going away. I mean, it's going to continue to generate a lot of revenue.
Just take a short drive through there.
Yeah, I mean, so, my sense is that people, throughout Texas, this is not just Permian Basin, also in New Mexico, view hydrogen as a new economic opportunity for growth. Very few people that I talk to get nervous about hydrogen displacing the oil and gas business or the industry. I think part of that is because we need it, as a society. And global energy use is going to continue to increase. Energy use is connected to economic prosperity. What hydrogen brings is opportunities for lowering the carbon intensity for the energy we use. And really new economic opportunities. So this idea of diversifying the energy economy in a location like the Permian Basin, where again some boom and bust cycles, prices of energy, things like that. So my sense is people are pretty interested in hydrogen, just in general. I want to go back to your policy question or comment about Texas. What's happening in the federal government is very interesting. I gave a talk in London. So there's a big effort in industrial decarbonization in Europe, and when they talk about that, it's largely hydrogen as to replace natural gas in heating and refineries and things like that. The folks in Europe, as they look at what's happening in the United States, are looking in awe. And so, because the scale of it, like the hydrogen hubs programs, the Inflation Reduction Act, the idea that you're not using sticks as policy levers, you're using carrots.
And they're figuring out their own carrots, right? I mean,
they are now because of what's happening in the United States, and they're worrying about not being able to compete, and they're also seeing how it's mobilized partnerships. So I think in terms of Texas policy, thinking about our unique geographic assets that we have, and also some challenges, So we've got these large cities, population areas, Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and then you have West Texas, that's where primarily the wind resources are, the solar resources. So on the one hand, the resources are there, but they're a bit removed from those population centers. So I think whatever policies are developed around hydrogen in Texas should kind of amplify what's happening in the federal policy, and also take advantage of our unique geographic resources. And keeping in mind that, policies for one region might actually hamper things in another region. So how do you develop policies that support what needs to happen in the Gulf Coast and support at the same time what has to happen in the Permian Basin, and recognizing that the Permian Basin versus the Gulf Coast has a hydrogen economy. There's already infrastructure there, whereas there's really not in that same way in the Permian Basin. So how do you incentivize economic development in the Permian Basin while not hampering what's happening in the Gulf Coast?
I'm curious from the folks on the stage, maybe this is a softball to you guys, obviously you're researchers and you're educators, but I'm curious from my perspective as well, sort of the need to know about sort of capital H hydrogen, how it works, how we talk about it as lowering the carbon intensity of energy production, things like that, or electricity. Is that something that we need to do a better job of sort of letting folks know, or is it okay to just say, hey, hydrogen's going to be a part of this mix. Don't worry about the sort of details of it. I'm curious about sort of how in the weeds we need to sort of be when we're doing these things.
I teach on hydrogen and do a lot of research on hydrogen, so I'm of course going to say it's really important to teach about it. I think this came up, so I'll reiterate from the discussion about equity and justice in the communities that are affected, because I think we can't just dismiss like rightful concerns from communities that have previously, I'll say, maybe been burned by building out industrial or energy infrastructure in those areas by just saying, you don't need to know, we've taken care of it, we're the engineers, cool. Everything's fine. Yeah. And so in that sense of it, I think being dismissive of education is not the right way to go about, particularly making sure that those communities are included in the conversation and feel like they have the information that they need and the understanding to know what is happening, to be engaged and informed in like being part of that process and being part of the design of those facilities. And if we need to, and so we should educate them so that they can be involved.
To tag on to that a little bit, I guess I wish my post this morning of my H2 at UT sticker got more likes than like my dinner last night, because nobody, not even my friends, as much as I talk about hydrogen, know what it's about. So yeah, we need to educate more people. But yeah, the community benefits, that's definitely one that's got to be early, often got to happen a lot. But I actually see a pull from students right now in UT. I cannot respond quickly enough to all the interest in doing hydrogen research with us. And, I've talked to Brian a lot about this, but it's hard for them to know where to go in the university right now. Sure. There isn't a specific hydrogen curriculum. We are trying to get that organized and get that developed, but I think it needs to happen soon, and because a lot of people just don't even understand what it's about. And I'm actually amazed students are coming to me knowing what it's about. They're doing their own research. I had one student, he'd already done his own little research projects. They weren't even part of a class. But he's that interested in hydrogen. So. Well,
it's also like the disconnect between, when you go to the gas station and you put refined product into your car, there's that connection with that commodity. Right. This feels a little different, right?
Not really. I mean,
no, that's great.
Fuel, you have a hydrogen fuel station at Pickle. You can go, get in their Toyota Mirai when they eventually get it and see what it feels like.
Toyota has invested a lot of money in this, you're right.
Pump some hydrogen.
Yeah, but it's still not very visible now, right? There aren't large deployments of it. Where we use hydrogen today, it's not like people routinely come in contact with it or see it. Yep. Luckily, very few people in California actually get to drive around Toyota Mirais and they come in contact with it. But I would imagine still a large portion of California, even where we have the most fueling stations, or really the only fueling stations in the U.S., probably still don't understand that that's even an option for them to drive.
Right.
Well, I think like workforce development type stuff, that's where it's, coming back to communities. And so people, it's one thing to not know what you don't know, right? So I think telling people in communities like, hey, there are these new jobs coming up in hydrogen, think about that as a career path or something like that. And maybe being able to present information and how closely it links to the oil and gas industry, or like as a solar developer or something like that, so people recognize. I mean, it's not going to be its own thing. There are these skills that overlap with hydrogen, so it's informing people about look into these are emerging jobs. Yep. Think keep your eyes open, and then the other thing is the people who are doing the training. When I talk to like workforce solutions, people who do kind of the training for jobs, apprenticeships, things like that. When I first, give them a call, start talking about hydrogen, they're like, "Wow, tell me more," and they want to know. Their job is to help prepare the emerging workforce, give people jobs, but also skilled labor that the companies are going to need as they're developing. So you don't have to bring people. I mean, we can bring people to Texas. That's great, but making sure that you're able to develop the new jobs for people who are already here. So I think in workforce development, education is really important. The environmental justice aspect, I think, is is also really important, and I think it's important to have the debates, on the...
Well, and the transparency, right?
Yeah, and on the earlier panel that Mark organized, just thinking about hydrogen is, okay, if we have a bunch of hydrogen now in the atmosphere, is there something we need to think about regarding that, as opposed to just sweeping under the rug and don't think about it.
Yeah.
Another thing that occurred to me too, educational wise, is with policymakers in Texas, right?
Educating the lawmakers about it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, some of the things that enabled the wind power industry were Texas policies that were piggybacking on top of federal policies.
Yep.
And that's where we're kind of at now. Are we going to piggyback? We've started that. But we participate in some of the Texas Hydrogen Alliance committees and calls. And they will tell you their first visits with legislators, their words, they didn't know how to spell hydrogen, right? So there's a large educational piece there if it's going to put in the policies that enable it. And I'll say, like, when Emily showed the graph of the hydrogen hub applications, it's really confusing for me when I look at that, when I see states fully colored and then little dots in other
why
states.
Is Texas not?
Why is Texas not fully colored? And, things tend to work a little differently in Texas, right? It's a little more business-oriented or whatever, and so that makes sense. But hopefully with the hubs, if they get awarded, some will get awarded in Texas, basically all of Texas can light up on that type of map with its own policy that, puts in the pipelines and really rockets this hydrogen industry.
Is the production tax credit the elephant in the room, specifically in the Permian Basin, from a policy perspective, from an economics perspective, from a research perspective even? That seems like once we figure out those rules and what they're exactly going to be, that dictates a lot, doesn't it? Especially in the Permian Basin, where we talk about leakage all the time. We talk about methane issues. This matters, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That tax credit is huge in terms of the amount per kilogram of hydrogen it is. It's kind of incredible, particularly at that higher level for $3, and particularly for how it could, because I love the way that if you couldn't pick up on that, I love the way that they structured it, that it's tiered. So it's not just if you're clean hydrogen, you have the whole range of less than 4 and you get the same, because I think that really adds the incentive to see if you can get yourself to one better tier. It will be interesting, and we kind of do some economic analysis looking at, 45Q versus 45V for these projects. Does it incentivize it to be cleaner? But I'm hopeful that because it's structured the way that it is, it will. And because it is life cycle, it means that we're not just talking about incentives to clean up the facilities. We're talking about incentives to clean up the leakage rates and the pipelines for the methane as well. And there are also, I didn't get a chance to talk about all of the policies in IRA and the bill as part of that, but there are also kind of coupled policies. One of the only sticks that we saw is the methane emission reduction program, which is also passed. So that's sort of fee per ton of methane that is emitted. So I think we have the coupling that will apply not just for hydrogen, but certainly with hydrogen in terms of, there's an incentive in terms of this tax credit to reduce the carbon intensity of your production. The calculation of that carbon intensity is based also on the leakage, and so you have to do that, but there's also a fee if you leak, so that the coupling in the way that these policies might interact in a really beneficial way to drive down the carbon intensity. Not only that, but the fact that it is defined by the carbon intensity. I think I can go back to what you're asking in terms of the colors of hydrogen. I think you have green hydrogen is the good hydrogen, blue hydrogen is the less hydrogen. We don't want gray or black hydrogen, and that really misses a huge piece of the puzzle. And so just the fact that the way that DOE is structuring the hubs in these programs to say, no, it's the carbon intensity that's really the impact that we're looking for, and that's how we're defining it. We're not putting values on, if it's blue, it's not as good as green. It's the carbon intensity, I think, will be really critical as well, not just for making sure that new technologies that can come in the future too, but in terms of just incentivizing fully cleaning across the whole life cycle of the system.
Well, and almost dictating the viability of a project, right? Go ahead, Mike.
So how does the PTC rules affect the Permian, right?
Production tax credit. He kept saying PTC in our meeting.
For hydrogen, clean hydrogen production tax credit. It almost in a way feels silly that we might award hubs before we have the rules for that production tax credit. but it'll be very impactful. This is almost just repeating what Emily was saying up there, but your upstream methane emissions, right? Well, a big part of that depends upon the pipeline, how long that is, and how many compressors along the way, and so forth, right? So that might really benefit the Permian and their natural gas production, right? And because it might be, chances are it is very difficult for natural gas to go from the Permian to the Gulf Coast and then still qualify for any PTC credit, right? But the same thing might apply even for the green pathways, as we mentioned with the EU framework. So I think when those rules come out, where hydrogen fits in Texas, those rules might actually make it favorable for the Permian over maybe the Gulf Coast in a lot of instances.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's a great opportunity because you have the great resources, not just in terms of natural gas, but also in terms of renewable production in the Permian. It could be a really interesting case study if you need to develop new demand for hydrogen in a region, that we could do all of that in the Permian and have the Permian sort of be a showcase, not just for the state, but also for the country of the Permian as Texas, as a great example of how you can develop a new hydrogen economy and a case study of improving and reducing leaks across national gas infrastructure. That's just very, very exciting, and that could be an opportunity I think Texas should make sure we don't miss out on.
And Brian,
bringing up communities too, right?
Yeah. I was going to ask you, Brian, the sort of idea of, because I think you're Emily and Mike, y'all are speaking to exactly this, sort of the envisioning of the new hydrogen economy in the Permian Basin inherently might look differently than even Southeast Texas, a few hundred miles away, but that's okay. That sort of like utilizing the resources that you have, the workforce that you have, sort of regionally where you are, that hydrogen economy might look different.
Yeah,
It's
well,
gonna look like Dubai.
Sure.
yeah,
Exactly.
I mean, we didn't talk about. I mean, there's so many unique things about the Permian Basin where you have assets and resources all in the same location. So you can start thinking about, if you think about the different energy technologies, and you link them together as a system in the Permian Basin. There's a lot of things there. You can do the hydrogen storage, you can do the CO2 storage, you can do CO2 capture, and all of that. The other thing is there are unique technology opportunities in the Permian. So, for example, one thing the Permian Basin has a lot of is produced water, which maybe they don't want. But how do you solve that challenge? Well, I mean, if you could do something with the produced water and make hydrogen from that, for example. Flaring is another challenge.
Sure.
So what do you do with the methane? Can you do something with the methane? So are there ways to kind of solve multiple problems at once by creating new systems that don't make sense in other geographies, but in the Permian Basin does? So where you can use produced water, clean it up enough to do electrolysis on it, capture the methane instead of flaring it, and maybe you set up a small unit to convert that to hydrogen on site, and then you take the CO2, you capture it, and maybe you do enhanced oil recovery. So you're actually taking something you'd be flaring, you then capture you use it to make hydrogen in addition to electrolysis or something like that,
Right.
and then you capture the CO2 to do enhanced oil recovery.
Zero waste.
So that's like, the magic system of systems thinking,
Right.
where those are the kind of opportunities that might present themselves in the Permian Basin. And if people can do the research to see if they work and create pilot scale projects, and if Texas creates the policy incentives and things like that to make it all work. I mean, someone was talking about, I think it was Lorena, about the risk of being the first adopter, right? So what kind of policies can Texas think of to sort of lower that risk for the ones who are still going to have risk, but do the first adoption of new technologies that can solve problems but create new economic opportunities?
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I was just going to say, going back to the water aspect, we have completed some of that research recently. The EIC grant funding, Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation helps fund some of this as well. There's a poster in the hallway specifically on this, and it shows kind of different ranges for the cost of water and its impact on your levelized cost of hydrogen. So hydrogen does present a unique opportunity to just produce water in the Permian, because at the end of the day, the cost of the water is it's pennies as far as the cost of your hydrogen. It's not dimes, right? It's not quarters. So if we can pay a little more to produce that water, take care of a big problem in the Permian that way with a high value commodity like hydrogen, it's a very interesting opportunity. That research focuses on electrolysis. We should not forget that water is used in steam methane reforming and autothermal reforming.
Exactly. Yep.
The water use is pretty close to the same, so anyway, they both need clean water. Even the steam methane reformer still uses deionized water. So,
well, it's also like any Permian Basin panel that you're on or that you're thinking about. That, talking about an elephant in the room, that is absolutely any sort of access to water, any sort of figuring out if you're going to recycle, if you're going to figure out how to, even store that water. It feels like, we're talking about hydrogen, we're talking about energy, but water is 100% sort of vital, to every sort of part of this. I'm curious too, are we getting cues from industry? Brian, I think you were speaking a little bit to this, but sort of the idea of industry understanding, what, we're going to fund this research, what we're going to make sure and lean into. Maybe we're not making all of our shareholders a whole ton of money right now on hydrogen, but if we have the research that tells us that it might be sort of an emerging economy and we can get out in front of that, it feels like industry sort of gets that. And I'll talk to the folks on the next panel about exactly this, but I'm curious from y'all's perspective as researchers, as folks who are applying to grants and things like that, if you're seeing sort of cues from industry, what we think this is pretty viable.
I'll speak about our hydrogen at scale demonstration project. We wrote that proposal in the spring of 2019. We're going to build this little proto hub. We're going to do a framework. We'll make our own little strategic plan for Texas. We didn't know it at the time, but what a hydrogen hub would look like. That wasn't a term yet. Half a year later, give or take, we get the award, and companies that were not part of our initial team started knocking on the door, right? They wanted to join. A year later, we still had companies knocking on our door. So our project team, there was UT and GTI Energy were the core research teams on that. And we had a few different industrial partners, right? Toyota's going to bring some vehicles, Waste Management's providing renewable natural gas. But today we're up over 15 industrial partners as part of that project. And a lot of them were our oil and gas companies. Chevron, Shell, ConocoPhillips are all part of that project. And in some of those cases, they were just starting to form their low carbon teams, right? Like taking their own initiative, forming their internal hydrogen teams. And those initial teams were just a couple of people. And now whenever I have the call, we just had one with ConocoPhillips. They had probably, 10 people on the call when we're updating them on some of our research. So we're seeing industries taking it serious for sure. And I think even with Mark Schuster here in GOH2, they have a pretty large industrial consortium that's joined that project, which, maybe early days he's pulling teeth. Now he probably has people knocking on his door to join. So
I think, Mark, you started that like when I started Energy Institute director, right? Like 2 years ago. Yeah, and it's flourished. I mean, it's pretty amazing to see how both these programs have grown.
Well, and it has to be encouraging for y'all to be able to tell your students, hey, we just got off a call, and instead of 2 people being on that call, it was 15 people on that call. Right. There are opportunities for y'all to, in this space, have jobs. I mean, essentially, that's the idea, right? Yeah. From y'all's perspective about, Emily, you were talking about the sort of the hydrogen rainbow. I'm curious about, you and I were talking a little bit about the range of when we're talking blue hydrogen, and sort of the range that we're talking about, especially when we're talking about the Permian Basin and we're talking about potential leakage. Give me sort of a sense of the way that we talk about the hydrogen rainbow now and the energy intensity and how that factors in, obviously, to the viability and to the cost and sort of how you make that work from a business perspective.
Oh, perfect. One of my favorite things to know on hydrogen rants about the hydrogen rainbow. So I think I'll start, in case there are any people in the audience who don't know kind of the full scope of the hydrogen rainbow. You have the gray, which is steam methane reforming of natural gas. Blue, which is you add CCS to that. Green, which would be electrolysis with renewable energy. Then you also get into pink, which I think they use to describe electrolysis with nuclear. You have turquoise, which is methane pyrolysis. I think white is maybe used for geologic hydrogen, which is obvious issues that we don't need to get into. Brown and black are what's described for coal gasification. I think there's also maybe an orange or a yellow. So now you can see that there's already everybody wants their color, and they start losing meaning when you get more behind 5 or 6. So I think that's the first challenge with using it. I think there's also the risk, and we see that, of people putting value on the colors and saying all blue is the same and all blue might be bad. When there's a big difference between a 60% capture facility that's, with a methane leakage of 3% versus a 96.5% with a methane leakage of 1% upstream. And those nuances get lost if you just look at the color and particularly write guidelines or policies based on the color. Similarly, for electrolysis, by definition, green is electrolyzers powered by renewable electricity.
Right.
But what if it's connected to the grid? What color is that? What's the carbon intensity of that? What's the carbon intensity of your grid? So I think you inevitably get back to asking some of those same questions that I was hoping to convey on those slides. And then the education comes into it a little bit, because you need to know that you need to ask those questions. And it's easy to get stuck into no, green is good, because I hear in the climate and energy and environmental space that green is good. So if you're telling me it's not green, then it must not be
green.
good. It's green. It's good.
Green means good.
Like trees. Right.
So I think that those are some of the risks with just using the colors and focusing on the hydrogen rainbow.
It gets really complicated too. Like in the case of yellow, I've seen it defined as electrolysis from the grid and then electrolysis from solar, which would be two different things when it comes to carbon intensity, right? I've seen naturally occurring hydrogen called white and gold, and gold's kind of yellow. I don't know, right? So it's super confusing. That's why the clean hydrogen hubs or clean hydrogen legislation has defined it by carbon intensity, right? So we can get away from, really they shall, the colors are convenient, right? It's kind of a convenient way to convey what you're talking about, but just how green, how blue, that, as Emily says, can get lost really quickly.
Because when you're talking about carbon intensity, you're talking about specific metrics.
Right.
Instead of blue hydrogen being, what percentage. I was hoping we got 50 minutes to hang out with these folks. I've been just badgering them with questions. So if we have any, I'd love to hear from y'all.
Can everybody hear me? Perfect. I have a question about education. I heard it mentioned several times, and we can all agree that it's a lofty goal. My question has several parts. How do you go about it? Number one. How much? Meaning, how do you know that you've done enough? And who pays for it? Thank you.
Well, I'll give a plug to Andy. Has an amazing idea of how to educate people about complicated, sometimes divisive issues in energy. So Andy Uhler, it probably says on his bio, but he's an energy journalism fellow in the Energy Institute at UT. So Andy just kind of hangs out at UT and walks around asking us energy questions and pretending he's not a journalist. So we answer him.
Everything is on the record.
But he faces this when he does reporting for Marketplace and everything at NPR. Like, how do you explain complicated issues in energy? So Andy's idea, and I'll let you say more about this, was to create a web portal that has information that kind of dives into the specifics but is digestible.
Yeah, the sort of idea, and it's a great question. It's something I think about every day, right? It's how in depth do you go in, because you don't want to put people off at the same time. The way that I think about this, and the words that I've been using have been entry point. And so I have these things that are about 600, 700 words, and it's how does hydrogen work? And then so and of course I do things like the average New York Times article is 667 words. So, okay, we're going to try to get it there. At the same time, what I've been trying to do is, if you want to dive in, then I'm going to have a ton of links to this stuff. And so, if you want to, and we're going to have links to, research papers and things like that. Right now, thankfully, the University of Texas and Columbia University are paying me to do this, so that's who's putting up the money. I think educational sort of institutions, I think, makes a whole lot of sense. I've been pitching this idea to public institutions and public radio specifically for 3 or 4 years. And so the idea is to make people, and I say this and I don't want it to sound pejorative at all, but it's like, if we can make folks just a little bit smarter about this stuff, it leads to a conversation that can then be had. Right now, if you don't have baseline knowledge about this stuff, it's just going to go over your head, and then you're just not going to, you're going to turn off. And so the thing I love about these sorts of things too, and especially when it's somebody like me who, I act like I know what I'm talking about. I absolutely don't. I get to ask these folks questions that I find interesting and that I find really important for kind of normal folks to understand. We can get into the weeds, and we do sometimes, but I think from my perspective anyway, that's sort of the goal, is to just make folks a little bit smarter. And then again, if they want to dive in, absolutely. And it's tough, right? Like, from y'all's perspective, I imagine, you're teaching students, but it's also, you're teaching really, really smart students who are focused on these sorts of ideas, and a lot of them are engineers. A lot of the folks that I'm talking to in public radio are not. And so, that kind of goofy, like, how do I explain this to a 5-year-old, or how would I tell my mom this story? That's kind of the thing that we talk about all the time. At the same time, what I'm constantly doing is making sure that I'm not dumbing it down too much or making it so superficial that it's actually wrong, right? That there are things and there are facts and there is data that I can't leave out, because then it just becomes me in front of a microphone talking about something. That's a great question. It's really tough.
Yeah, it depends on what you're kind of getting at. If you come to educate people in the general public in this day and age, people are going to be skeptical. You have to be able to meet people in the middle with their current understanding, have some empathy for their situation, whatever it might be, and try to have a dialogue, like what Andy's saying, and give enough information that provides enough of the whole picture so that there's some trust and you can have that conversation. It's a bit of a challenge right now. Our social media and everything directs us to, my feed, I guess, looks like what I guess I believe in. I don't know.
That's what you're told to believe in.
Yeah, maybe. So.
You also struggle, if you know a whole lot about something, you don't want to condescend either, right? You don't want to sound like you're way smarter than that person. So if you're exactly right, sort of having the empathy and also just listening. All of my job, I sit here and I'm talking to, and asking these questions, but all of my job is listening. And so figuring out exactly sort of what's coming through and how to talk to people about this stuff. It's hard. But I think that's sort of the task, Thank you.
I changed the slide to the actual
Permian
Basin one.
So that's what we've been talking about the whole time.
So if anybody wants to expand on that, or hopefully it'll elicit some questions. So It's a region that's very rich in oil and gas and wind. And actually, part of it's solar also. So it's energy rich in many ways.
And I saw this map. I think one of you, someone showed this map before.
Yeah, I shared it earlier, but it's actually from BEG.
So I was waiting for this map to come up because I wanted to make a comment too, and I don't think I properly answered your very first question to me, but it looks like nothing's happening in New Mexico. which is not true. It's just that this study was done by Bureau of Economic Geology. I think that's where
some of those dots cross the border a little bit. I'm kidding.
No, and so this is another aspect of the emerging hydrogen economy that I think is really exciting about the Hydrogen Hub program. Is incentivizing people to work together in ways that they're not already doing. So either industrial partners on the supply side and demand side, different states, different regions. So right now I'm in the process with a bunch of different folks trying to create something called the Permian Energy Development Lab that focuses on the entire Permian, not just Texas side, but also New Mexico. And some of the interesting things about doing that is the politics on both sides, or at least the state politics, are very, very different. The policies are very different. In New Mexico, there's a lot of federal land, where not so much on the Texas side. So it's interesting to think about the region and how just because you draw a border, like a state border, I mean, that's there because there are policy differences. But if you talk to people in southeast New Mexico, their sentiment about oil and gas is pretty much the same as people in Midland and Odessa, regardless of what the senators of New Mexico feel and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Can I go back to the education
Absolutely.
question? Because I think we can also think about, which makes sense since we're sitting here for the University of Texas students, at the university as potential people and how we educate them, sort of the students being representative of the future workforce that we know we're going to need for hydrogen. And so we have almost, did I hear somebody say 80 sort of researchers, faculty, staff here at UT who are working on hydrogen. But do we have any hydrogen courses that we teach as a full semester? Is hydrogen something that we need to be thinking about, not just like specific courses? How do we incorporate it into existing courses? Do we think about, do we need some kind of hydrogen major similar to the way we have things like petroleum engineering? So I think that's another area of education that we can definitely be thinking about. Everything is moving so quickly with hydrogen. We're not, behind, but I think UT could probably definitely be a leader in thinking about how we modify, change, or add to our current curriculum for students in that regard.
Absolutely.
And maybe
Challenge thrown to UT.
Yeah, so as a researcher at UT, we're definitely finding ourselves educating students. They're knocking on my door these days to participate in hydrogen. That wasn't the case a few years ago, I'll admit. But one thing I think also, like, how do you do this education? How do you get that out there? Like, in my line of research, we're doing applied research more often than not, right? So I'm not making the next latest, greatest fuel cell membrane material like Rom wasn't presented on this morning, but we're trying to use the fuel cell in a new application. So a lot of my research ends up building something like a new fuel cell vehicle and going off and deploying it. Or when we are putting in our hydrogen facility at the Pickle Research Campus, I'm going to find myself educating first responders, right? The fire department, EMS people. We had a hydrogen fuel cell UPS van that went into service out in California. It's gone to multiple UPS service centers within California, Northern California and Southern California. And each time we do that, we have to educate the mechanics, the drivers, that entire staff on what's going on there. We have to help them evaluate their facilities if it's compatible with hydrogen. We've done the same thing with Capital Metro here in town. Over the years, they have driven around 2 different fuel cell buses. Probably not many people know of that. But been doing that project, we had to teach them how to fuel the bus, how to drive, operate the bus, what to look for. So anyway, I think just by doing a lot of the research, and as researchers trying to make sure we're communicating that to the public, just doing it.
We have a question over here.
Hi, so for government officials or elected officials, what do you think is the next step in terms of like a bill or a policy or a law for that hydrogen development in the Permian Basin?
I feel like that's an obvious question for me, and I don't have a good answer for it. I think there's.
I have some thoughts.
Oh, great, go for it.
Well, I've said this maybe a dozen times now today, but I think it's maybe trying to mimic the wind power model, right? Yeah. So there was the Renewable Portfolio Center that said, hey, we're going to do this much new wind power, this much year by year, right? So why can't we do something for clean hydrogen? For the state, right, to incentivize that, build upon whatever comes out of these hydrogen hubs. And then when we get that capacity up, be ready to help move that hydrogen across the state through, mimicking the competitive renewable energy zones. that's kind of where I think, and I'm copying something, so I'm not that it's not like my bright idea. I'm just looking at what happened in the past for another clean energy resource and seeing how it could apply here. So.
A lot of times it's infrastructure that can be limiting, and so policy incentive, if the time is right and there should be, there's an economic reason to have a hydrogen pipeline built from the Permian to the Gulf Coast. If there's some policies that help make that happen sooner rather than later, for example, that can be really useful. So I think, I think Mike is exactly right with thinking about some of the policy levers that have used in the past to create new markets and help develop an energy economy that didn't exist for a certain technology. And a lot of times that's about infrastructure.
And like you said, de-risk, right?
De-risking. You certainly, I don't think you want to put up policy roadblocks either. It's already going to be hard enough. So you want to ensure that whatever people are doing is equitable across the state. You don't want to do something that really hurts like landowners in West Texas in a way that's not fair, things like that. So you want to protect people, you want to make sure things are safe, but at the same time not, carefully thoughtful policies that incentivize economic development, that don't put up roadblocks that don't need to be there,
I think we had a question over there.
All right. Thanks, everybody. This is great. Kind of following on the last question, and maybe a common thread through a lot of these discussions has been the education, the community aspect. Carbon capture is maybe actually not technologically ahead of green hydrogen electrolysis, but from an implementation standpoint, we've maybe see it a little bit ahead. Just in the news from the Dakotas and Louisiana with community opposition now to permits and pipelines, sort of the cross-country challenges that some of these projects have. Curious, just general thoughts on the very large scale of many of these hydrogen projects, right? The nature of the mega project and the location that we're seeing, right? You want to bring the jobs back to the energy communities, the environmental justice themes, but is it just really a lot more of the same in terms of a lot of potentially unseen risks, hard to account for risks, permitting challenges, lack of jurisdictional authority? What are some of the big hurdles that you see? I appreciate all the comments on educating, the workforce and the economy side of it, but as a developer, I think one of the biggest hidden risks of any energy project is just straight up community opposition, whether it's sort of.
I'll give a couple comments, and then Emily and Mike have thought, I think, more deeply about this, about specifics. But a couple of risks I see. I think blue hydrogen, carbon capture and storage at scale is further along. If you look at the cost, it's cheaper. I think scaling up electrolysis, you still have some challenges. There's supply chain issues with getting electrolyzers, stuff like that. So I would actually say, I think, like doing something like SMR, ATR with carbon capture and storage is kind of more economically viable, and that's what I'd love to hear their comments. I think in Texas, if you're doing carbon capture and storage to make the hydrogen, you have to store the CO2 somewhere. And so getting permit for a Class 6 well, I think, in Texas is, I think that's a big issue right now.
I don't know if I have a solution for you, but yeah, you're exactly right. I think in the news just a few weeks ago, a large electrolyzer facility in North Texas made the news headlines because they signed some water rights deal with that city, county, whatever the municipality it was, and the citizens said, well, wait, we didn't get a chance to vote on this. Why are you selling our water, our valuable resource? So that's always going to be a risk, and it goes back to kind of what the CBP community benefits panel up here was talking about earlier, just reaching out to those communities. That facility probably would have done themselves a lot of good to have had these communications open in front of the community prior to signing some deal, eking some deal with, I don't know, whoever the authority was that could do that. So, yeah, it's always going to be a risk. It's put a number of projects out. I think maybe, in educating what clean hydrogen can do for the community will be a big part of that. And I know, like today, we focused a lot, people talked about emissions. I think most people think of that as CO2. But when it comes to having clean hydrogen in your community, I think John Hall was basically referring to this up here, but that clean hydrogen, it's not only cleaning up CO2, it's cleaning up other pollution, right? Particulate matter, NOx, things that are more near-term health benefits, something a little more tangible for communities to realize or understand or grasp that would be a direct benefit to their community if they have this cleaner energy industry in their community versus maybe business as usual.
Yeah, I think there is a risk that this could just be more of the same. I mean, we're talking about very capital-intensive, large industrial facilities to produce and then consume hydrogen. But I'm also, and you've listed a lot of those risks in terms of community opposition, permitting, right-of-ways, et cetera, all of those things as well. So I won't reiterate that. But I'm optimistic that while there's a risk we could do it as more of the same, because a lot of this will be new, there's an opportunity that we can do it differently. And so I'm optimistic because we've seen things like the Justice 40 initiative and that executive order, and now that environmental justice and the equity is really front and center in the conversation, and those groups are at the table. I'm optimistic that we won't succumb to that risk, but so much of this is new, it's kind of yet to be seen.
Okay, with that, why don't we thank our panelists?